What I'm going to talk about in this presentation is the mass strike process. What all of us saw happen in the first 2 months of this year in Tunisia, in Egypt, and then throughout the Arab world is a mass strike process. A process of workers going into motion as a class and achieving change, social change, through that process. A lot of you have heard these events talked about in the mass media as if they were something that only happened for the first time in 2011 and were connected with things that are very new, like Facebook, like the social media. People have called the Egyptian revolution the Facebook revolution. These new media certainly had a role, but the process that took place has been going on in the working class for over a century, long before these media existed. And it's important that we understand, by looking at the history of this process, what has actually happened, so that we can get, as workers, some idea of how this process can be moved forward, not only in the Arab world, but in the rest of the world, because everywhere today the working class is facing similar problems to that faced by workers in the Middle East. So what I'm going to do is try and briefly discuss some examples of the mass strike process from history, and then discuss some common principles about how mass strikes function and how they function today. So actually, the first mass strikes that took place, that are recorded in history, took place in Russia at the end of the 19th century, in 1896. At that time, Russia was under the rule of the Tsar. It was an extremely autocratic regime. Excuse me, unions were illegal, of course. There was a global recession going on, which also affected the newly emerging industry in Russia. And over an initially trivial incident, the firing of a worker, workers started to go out on strike in textile mills in Russia. Within days, this strike spread spontaneously to 40,000 workers. The strike was unsuccessful, but the following year, in 1897, these strikes were repeated in many cities throughout Russia. And as a result of the explosive spread of these strikes throughout the textile industry and beyond the textile industry to involve workers, other workers who went out on strike in sympathy with the textile workers, the workers actually achieved a fundamental gain, which was the guarantee of an 11-hour day. And believe it or not, in 97, 11-hour day was an improvement over the 14-hour days that many of them had been working. This movement recurred in Russia in a wave of mass strikes that started in 1902 in the southern Russian city of Baku. In 1903, there was a wave of mass strikes that covered all of South Russia. Again, workers starting in localized strikes, facing repression, and sympathy strikes spontaneously breaking out all across this region. In 1905, the crisis in Russia became greater after Russia's defeat in the Russo-Japanese War. And the regime was very discredited. There was again an economic crisis. There was mass unemployment, and out of this mass unemployment came a demonstration in the capital, in St. Petersburg. The workers were fired on by the Tsarist troops. And as a result of this repression, there was a general strike in St. Petersburg, which then spread throughout the to Moscow and throughout all of Russia, which became known historically as the 1905 Revolution. Out of these mass strikes, and we'll see this happening again later in history, workers started to organize. They started to organize spontaneous formations in which workers would elect delegates to broader organizations, sometimes at the district level, sometimes the whole city. In Russia, at that time, they were called workers' councils. The Russian term for council is Soviet. So these were the first Soviets that came into being in 1905 in the big cities of St. Petersburg and Moscow. Eventually, the mass strikes led to unsuccessful insurrections in Moscow and St. Petersburg. The revolution was eventually crushed, but the employers in Russia were so frightened by the power of this mass strike that they actually gave significant concessions during the revolution, many of which were not retracted after the revolution was crushed. I spoke of winning the 11-hour day. In 1905, workers in many industries won the 8-hour day, long before the 8-hour day was achieved, for example, in the United States or in the Western parliamentary regimes. So, after the 1905 revolution, revolutionaries looked back on this process and tried to draw some lessons out of it. And one of the leading people who did that was the Russian socialist revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg, who wrote about it in the pamphlet which she entitled The Mass Strike. And in this pamphlet, she looked at the Russian example to draw certain patterns out of this. And what she found was that in all cases, the mass strikes, first of all, arose basically spontaneously. They were not called by a single central body, the way we hear of one-day general strikes being called, for example, in Europe. What happened was local workers went into action, faced repression, and repression is almost always a part of this story. And in response to that repression, shootings, firings, beatings, other workers came out in support. That's one characteristic. The second characteristic is that mass strikes spread. And it is that spread that is extremely frightening to the ruling class, because with that spread comes growing organization. And all of these mass strikes led to temporary forms of organization that brought together whole sections of the class. The third characteristic is that workers were going into action for interests that affected the whole class. Either they were economic interests that affected the whole class, like, for example, the battle for shorter hours, or, in almost all cases, economic demands became intertwined with political demands. In the case of Russia, became intertwined with demands for the downfall of the autocracy, the abolition of Tsarism. And finally, when confronted with the growing organization, with the open-ended spread of these strikes that have democratic organization that springs from the mass movement itself and is not easily controlled or channeled, the ruling class often gave concessions. They gave concessions to stop the strike movement, at least temporarily. On the other hand, the fact that the mass strikes won concessions often led to at a future point, broader or repeated mass strikes because workers were learning that this was, in fact, an effective way of fighting. And one other point that Luxemburg made was that in these struggles, there was a mass transformation of consciousness. Because workers who in Russia at that time, just like in Egypt, in America today, in Europe, in their day-to-day lives, do not work collectively with other workers. They live most of their lives as individuals in small groups and family groups, implicitly in competition with other workers. It is in these mass movements, in these mass strikes, that workers come to see themselves as part of a class, as part of a mass group of individuals who have a common interest that they can only achieve through collective struggle. And that transformation of millions of, in some cases, millions of people, is what makes revolutions possible. Let me go on to a second example from the United States, much later in history, 30 years after these events. In 1934, the United States and the rest of the world was in the grips of the Great Depression. The Depression was at its height. Unemployment in the United States was something around 25%. So conventional strikes were totally impossible because there were millions of people unemployed. Strikes were practically illegal. Picket lines were broken by the police, and with picket lines broken, there were plenty of people willing to take strikers' jobs. So conventional strikes were almost impossible. As a result, employers were cutting wages, something that probably is familiar to people these days, mass unemployment and lots of wage cuts. However, there had been an organizing process going on for about 4 years among especially the unemployed, which had led to mass organizations of the unemployed
It'll stop in a minute.
We can edit this part out.
Okay.
This process led to mass organizations of the unemployed who were consciously fighting in coordination with employed workers, seeing the issues as class issues, not as issues of unemployed fighting employed for jobs. In